The snow had a way of swallowing sound on that road, turning the world into a white tunnel where the only thing that seemed alive was steel and exhaust. Soviet T-26 light tanks crawled forward in a column, their engines grumbling under the weight of armor and frozen mud, the tracks grinding ice into dirty slush. Inside the lead tank, Lieutenant Alexei Sokolov pressed his glove against the periscope, rubbing away a thin crust of frost so he could see the endless row of pines ahead, bowed under powdery snow. The air inside the cramped steel shell smelled of oil, sweat, and stale tobacco, warmed by the engine heat that somehow never reached his frozen toes. Over the intercom, muffled by static, someone in the second tank back started laughing, and the laughter passed down the line of machines, bouncing between engines and men like some traveling spark. The Finns with their bottles? One of his crew joked earlier that morning. Maybe they're planning a toast when we reach their capital. Alexei had chuckled with the others, because it was easier to laugh at stories of burning bottles and peasants with gasoline than to think about the cold that had seeped into his bones since November. Outside, the sky was a dull, iron gray, and the light never quite decided if it was dawn or late afternoon. The road was little more than a narrow scar between trees, a strip of packed snow flanked by drifts that rose like low, white walls. Somewhere out there, beyond the tree trunks, Finnish ski patrols were said to be gliding silently, invisible as ghosts. But inside the tank, those were rumors, not threats. The real enemy, as far as Alexei was concerned, was the ice that locked the Traverse Ring or the frost that crept into the optics. Every time he shifted in his seat, the fabric of his padded jacket rasped against metal, and he could feel the vibration of the tracks through his spine. High Command had promised this operation would be quick, a sharp blow by the Red Army that would push the border west and teach the Finns the meaning of Soviet power. Tanks like his were the proof of that promise. 30 tons of steel, a cannon, a machine gun, and the authority of a modern state rolling on frozen tracks. It was easy to laugh at the idea that any of that could be threatened by a glass bottle. Glass broke. Steel did not. A bottle was something you drank from at home, not something that could stop an armored column. The men had heard the stories, of course, whispered around field stoves and in drafty barracks. Small Finnish detachments hurling flaming jars at the ventilation grills of tanks, sending them up like torches in the night. But those were always stories told in the same tone as ghost tales, half believed and quickly dismissed with a joke and a shrug. If a bottle could stop a tank, one driver had said with a grin, why did Moscow bother building us all this armor? No one had an answer to that, and so the question became its own punchline, repeated in different forms as the column inched deeper into the forest. The crews rolled forward under a low sky, wrapped in their confidence in the clatter of their tracks, unaware that somewhere ahead, in the same woods, men were quietly filling crates with glass and fuel. On the Finnish side of the line, the cold bit sharper, as if the wind were angry at the very idea of resistance. In a village that no longer showed on Soviet maps, a squad of Finnish soldiers crouched around a wooden crate, their breath rising in little clouds that mingled with the faint smell of gasoline. Corporal Lorinimi, his cheeks raw from the wind and his beard crusted with frost, reached into the crate and lifted one of the bottles. It was an ordinary glass vodka bottle, its label half torn and the glass cloudy from age, but inside was a mixture of gasoline and something darker, thicker, that clung to the insides like slow-moving tar. He held it carefully, as if it were both fragile and dangerous, which it was, and examined the rag stuffed into the neck. Too loose, he murmured, his voice low but firm, and he pulled the rag out to twist it tighter before ramming it back into place. Around him, other pairs of hands repeated the same motions, turning civilian glass into military tools. The shed they were using as a workshop was barely warmer than the outside air, but it at least cut the wind. The scent of pine boards mixed with the sharp fumes of fuel, making everyone's eyes water. A few men had tied strips of cloth around their noses and mouths in a futile effort to filter the smell. A lantern hung from a beam, its flame flickering whenever the door opened to admit another man carrying bottles or cans of gasoline, casting unsteady shadows on the walls. Outside, skis and rifles leaned against the logs, ready for the moment the work inside turned into action outside. Lori knew perfectly well that what they were doing was born of desperation. The Soviet tanks were real, heavy things, with armor that laughed at rifle bullets and machine gun rounds, and Finland did not have enough anti-tank guns to face them everywhere they appeared. So they had done what small nations on the defensive always did. They looked for cheap ways to hurt expensive machines. Someone had started calling them Molotov's cocktails, a bitter joke that spread quicker than any official term. When the Soviet foreign minister, Vyacheslav Molotov, had declared in his broadcasts that the Soviets weren't bombing Finland but rather delivering food parcels, the Finns had decided to let him drink something in return. If Molotov is giving us food, a radio operator had joked in Lori's hearing, we should give him a cocktail. The name stuck, and now the men in the shed used it with a dark humor that masked their anxiety. They tested mixtures, adding thickening agents to help the burning fuel cling to metal, and Sometimes one of the bottles would slip from numb fingers and shatter on the floor, filling the air with fumes and curses. Each failure was a reminder. These were not trained chemists or weapons engineers, just soldiers and farmers trying to invent a weapon between patrols. Laurie wiped fuel from his glove, feeling the chill as it soaked into the fabric, and thought about the Soviet tanks he had seen. The way their engines smoked in the cold, the weak points in their armor, the little hatches where men had to emerge to breathe or see. The first time he had seen a Soviet tank from up close, it had been lumbering along a road not far from the front, its tracks chewing through snow as if it were flour. He had crouched beside a drift with his squad, watching the turret turn, the barrel sweeping past them as if searching for some target just beyond their hiding spot. The machine had seemed invincible, a moving bunker with a heart of steel, and his rifle had felt suddenly as flimsy as a toy. But then he had noticed the small things, the way frost formed around the exhaust, the way steam rose from vents and grills, and how the engine noise changed when the tank climbed a small ridge of ice. He had watched the crewman's head in the open hatch, the fur hat pulled low but still leaving skin exposed to the wind, and realized that inside the steel were men just as vulnerable to fear and fire as anyone else. A tank, he understood, was a fortress only as long as its crew believed it was untouchable. Now, as he and his men stacked the prepared bottles in wooden crates lined with straw, Laurie imagined those tanks again, confined to narrow roads where their flanks were exposed to the trees. That was where the Finnish advantage lay, not in heavy guns or thick armor, but in knowledge of the terrain and the ability to move silently through snow on skis where tanks could only crawl. Their command had explained the plan in simple, direct terms. The Soviet tanks had to use the roads. The Finnish troops did not. The bottles would not be thrown from the front, bravely but foolishly, into machine gun fire. Instead, patrols would shadow the columns, waiting for the right moment to slip close, strike the vulnerable spots with fire, and vanish back into the forest before the Russians could respond. It was not a grand strategy in the style of thick, leather-bound manuals, but it was a strategy all the same, drawn with lines of glass and fuel on the white canvas of Finnish snow. While the Finns were refining their cocktails in Soviet staff huts miles behind the front line, maps were being smoothed out on tables and covered with neat arrows of red pencil. On paper, everything was simple. The Red Army had overwhelming numbers in men, artillery, and tanks, and the Finnish defenses were thinly spread along an enormous frontage. Past the borders and the forests lay the promise of ports on the Baltic, airfields, and a strategic buffer that would move the threat of invasion further from Leningrad. Officers whose boots had never sunk into the deep Finnish snow traced paths for armored units as if moving chess pieces, confident that the other side had little that could stand in their way. Reports of resistance were chalked up to initial friction, to be smoothed out once the full weight of Soviet industry and manpower began to roll. The ordinary soldiers and tank crews saw a different side of the war. Their maps were the frozen lakes they had to cross, the snowdrifts that refused to compact under boots, and the dense woods where visibility shrank to a few meters between trunks. When they bivouacked, they did so in half-frozen tents or dugouts that never quite kept out the wind, their breath condensing in the air and freezing on the canvas overhead. They listened to the creak of settling ice and the occasional pop of a distant rifle shot, wondering if it had been aimed at someone they knew. If they heard anything about bottle bombs, it was in the form of jokes, repeated like spells around campfires. "The Finns are so poor," one loader said one night, holding his tin mug close to a sputtering stove. "They throw their empty vodka bottles at our tanks. Maybe next they'll throw their boots." The others laughed because the alternative was to admit that they did not understand this enemy or this winter. In the official training sessions, when they had any, the instructors focused on familiar topics: how to keep the engine warm in the cold, how to avoid bogging down the tank, how to coordinate with infantry. No one stood in front of a chalkboard and drew a bottle of gasoline. No one talked about what would happen if burning fuel ran over the engine deck, seeped through the cracks in the turret ring, or choked the air filters. Some had heard of such attacks in the Spanish Civil War, where improvised firebombs had been tossed from balconies and windows at tanks crawling through city streets. But Spain felt very far away from the endless spruce trees of Karelia. With every kilometer they advanced, they felt more secure in their armor, convinced that whatever these Finns might throw at them, bullets, grenades, curses, it would bounce off the hardened steel. Arrogance, like frost, had settled over the army without anyone noticing. Back in the shed, the Finns finished their work for the day as the light outside dimmed from gray to almost black. Laurie ran gloved fingers along the edge of a crate, counting the bottles by touch because it was too cold to take off his mittens and too dark to see the glass clearly. Every clink of glass against glass was a warning. If one broke here, inside, the fire might take them as surely as any enemy shell. "Enough for one column," one of his men said quietly, nodding at the stacked crates. "If we use them well," Laurie answered. He stepped outside, where the cold hit lit with a clarity that almost tasted clean after the fumes inside, and looked toward the tree line. Somewhere beyond the last ranks of pines was the road that Soviet tanks favored, a gray ribbon they seemed unable to let go of, and somewhere beyond that, in the direction of the border, burned the dull, invisible anger of a small country under attack. The plan for the coming days was simple, as all good ambushes were. A recon patrol on skis would shadow the Soviet column, staying out of sight but close enough to hear the engines and count the machines. When they reached a stretch of road with steep ditches and dense trees, somewhere the tanks could not easily fan out, the skiers would fall back and signal. A blocking detachment would already have laid felled trees or obstacles further along the road, forcing the column to slow, bunch up, and stop. Then, from the cover of the forest, small anti-tank teams would close in on skis from the sides and rear, each man carrying several bottles nested in straw-filled satchels, with a few men holding rifles and submachine guns to cover them. Fire would be the main actor, bullets the supporting cast. It was not an attack designed to look heroic on a propaganda poster. It was designed to kill engines, blind crews, and turn steel coffins into actual coffins. When the day finally came, the forest felt even more silent than usual, as if the trees were holding their breath. The sky was low and heavy with clouds, threatening snow that refused to fall, and a faint wind stirred powdery drifts at the base of trunks. Laurie knelt behind a rough screen of evergreen branches just 20 meters from the road, his skis planted in the snow behind him like crossed spears, and watched the narrow strip of packed white where the Soviet tanks would appear. Beside him, two of his men crouched in similar cover, each with a bundle of bottles cradled in their arms, rags already twisted but still unlit. The crisp air carried the sharp, faint smell of fuel from their cargo. Further down the line, other teams lay hidden, their breathing misting the air behind homemade camouflage. A single bird called once and fell silent, as if remembering this was not a place where anything but machines should make noise. The first sound of the column was felt rather than heard, a tremor running through the snow and into the bones, a low vibration that seemed to rise from the earth itself. Then came the engine noise, muted by the trees but building, a grinding metallic growl mixed with the clatter of tracks. A murmur passed along the finish line, a few gestures to confirm positions, and then the men became still again, their world shrinking to their own small arc of forest and the patch of road in front of them. Laurie peered through a gap in the branches and saw the lead tank emerge from the curtain of trees further down, its turret turning slightly as if sniffing the path ahead. Snow sprayed from under its tracks as it climbed a small ridge in the road, and exhaust smoke hung in the air behind it like a dirty banner. One tank, then another, and another, their green paint dull and frosted at the edges, their red stars dim in the weak light. Inside that lead tank, Alexei Sokolov hunched a little in his seat, trying to force circulation back into his legs. He could see very little through the periscope, a narrow slice of world in which the road was a white streak framed by darker blurs, but the engine noise comforted him, a constant, mechanical heartbeat. Over the intercom, his driver muttered about the snow, how the layer beneath was turning to ice and making the tracks slip. At least the Finns are too busy drinking their cocktails to clear the roads. The loader joked from behind, and the gunner chuckled. The joke had grown teeth in the last weeks, becoming a kind of ritual line whenever they passed through empty stretches of forest. They had seen burned-out vehicles along other roads, victims of mines or artillery, but no one in their company had yet faced what the rumors described. Bottles and fire were still stories, still something to be laughed at. The column slowed slightly as it approached the point where felled trees, carefully placed days earlier by Finnish engineers, narrowed the route even more. The tanks compressed their spacing, bunching together like beads on a tightened string, the gaps between them shrinking to lengths that felt safe from artillery, but were disastrous when the road was the only path forward. Infantry clung to the sides of some vehicles or trudged behind, their boots sinking into dirty snow, their heads ducked against the cold. The sound of engines, the smell of exhaust, and the creak of equipment blended into a dull roar that filled the road and spilled into the forest. In the trees, Finnish fingers tightened on bottlenecks and rifle grips. If anyone else had been watching from above, they might have seen how fragile the whole thing looked, a command of mechanized power confined to a single white line, surrounded on both sides by a sea of snow and pines. The signal was a simple flare, fired from deeper in the woods where the blocking detachment lay. It rose above the treetops, a brief streak of red against the gray canvas of the sky, and then vanished. For a moment the Soviet crews and infantrymen looked up, puzzled to see what it meant. "Probably ours," someone muttered. In his cramped commander's seat, Alexei frowned, uneasy, but before he could decide on a response, the first first tanks at the front of the column reached the obstacle. The felled trees lay across the road in a tangle that would have required time and tools to clear, and the lead driver braked sharply, the tank lurching to a halt. The second tank stopped to avoid ramming it, and the third and fourth hesitated, engines revving as the column began to compress further, the ordered march turning into a crowded metal snake coiling on itself. The infantry bunched up as well, milling with uncertainty on the road. That was the moment the Finnish skiers had been waiting for. From both sides of the road, figures in white parkas emerged from the trees, moving low and fast on skis over the snow. The first few appeared almost as ghosts, their outlines blurred against the drifts, but the bundles of bottles they held made their intent unmistakable to anyone who looked closely. Most of the Soviet soldiers on foot did not. Their eyes were on the obstacle ahead, or on their own freezing hands. Laurie pushed off from his hiding spot, skis whispering over the snow as he glided down toward the road, the weight of the bottles pulling at his shoulders. His heart hammered loud in his ears, louder than the engine noise now that he was leaving the cover of the trees. He could feel the cold air claw at his lungs and the faint slosh of fuel as the bottles bumped together in their straw-lined pack. To throw a bottle of burning fuel at a tank, you first had to make fire. Laurie slid to a stop behind the trunk of a tree that stood just a few meters from the road, its roots half exposed where the snow had drifted thin, and knelt to work. With fingers that felt thick and clumsy inside his gloves, he pulled one bottle free, checked the rag one last time, and struck a match. For a heartbeat, nothing happened but the scratch of sulfur and the tiny flare of light. Then the rag caught, the flame running along the fibers and licking at the glass. The heat warmed the air around his face for a second, a small, fierce reminder of what they were about to unleash. Around him, he saw other pinpricks of orange appear at the forest edge as his comrades lit their own fuses. The tanks on the road were so close now that he could see frost melting on their hulls from the exhaust heat, steam rising in slow curls. Inside Alexei's tank, the first warning came as a shout over the intercom. "Movement on the left!" The gunner barked. Alexei pressed his eye harder to the periscope, scanning, but all he saw at first was white and trees. The world outside his narrow field of view felt suddenly too big. "Infantry?" he demanded. "I can't tell," came the reply, tinged with a note of confusion. Then something bright flared at the edge of his vision, a small, unnatural orange against the white and gray of the forest. His mouth went dry. What is that? He did not yet have the word in his mind, but his gut knew it was wrong. On the road behind him, another commander was already shouting, this time not about movement, but about fire. The first bottles flew in rough arcs from the tree line, leaving short trails of flame as the burning rags streaked through the air. They hit the flat surfaces of tank hulls and engine decks with dull, sickening thumps, glass shattering and liquid fire splashing outward. On one of the tanks in the middle of the column, a bottle struck the ventilation grill at the rear, its contents exploding in a sudden whoosh that sent flames crawling eagerly into every gap and hole. Burning fuel flowed like a living thing, clinging to metal and spreading along edges, pouring down over the rear plate and into the engine compartment. The smell hit a second later, a thick, oily stench of gasoline and something acrid, carried by a blast of hot air that felt like a punch to anyone exposed. Laurie's own throw landed slightly lower than he had hoped, smashing against the engine deck of a tank whose turret was turned slightly away from him. For a heartbeat, he feared it had been wasted, just another burst of flame on cold armor. Then he saw the fire pour into the gap between hull and turret, drawn by some invisible draft, and vanish inside. A second later, smoke began to seep out, at first a faint gray, then darker, thicker, edged with tongues of orange. The tank's engine revved in distress, the sound climbing in pitch as if the machine itself were panicking. He grabbed a second bottle, fingers working faster now, and lit the rag with the last of the matchbox. This time he aimed for the open hatch, where he had seen a head appear, and though the bottle shattered on the rim instead of inside, the effect was no less brutal. Fire licked around the opening, turning it into a glowing ring, and the head disappeared with a scream that was lost in the growing chaos. The Soviet reaction was a mix of disbelief and raw, sudden fear. On the road, infantrymen shouted and scattered, some firing wildly into the trees, their bullets sending up spurts of snow and splinters of bark. Others tried to smother the flames with greatcoats or snow scooped up with bare hands, only to watch in horror as the burning fuel stuck to fabric and skin. Inside the tanks, the crews felt the heat as an enemy more intimate than any shell. The interior of a tank was designed to keep out bullets and shrapnel, not fire that seeped in through cracks and ventilation ducts. Smoke filled the cramped spaces in seconds, making eyes water and lungs burn. The intercom lines crackled with shouts, commands mingling with coughing, and, in some cases, pure cries of terror. In his own vehicle, Alexei felt the first breath of hot air on his face, a sudden wave that cut through the cold like a slap. The periscope blurred as smoke filmed the glass, and he tore his eye away, blinking furiously. Somewhere behind him, the engine's tone changed. A ragged cough that should not have been possible. "We're on fire!" the driver screamed, his voice shrill and thin compared to his usual mutter. Alexei grabbed for the hatch latch, his glove slipping on metal now hot enough to burn through fabric, and yanked it open. A column of black smoke poured in, tasting of fuel and scorched paint. For the first time since the war had begun, the tank felt less like a shelter and more like a trap. "Out! Out!" he shouted, his voice raw, and pulled himself up through the hatch. The air outside was freezing, but after the heat inside, it hit him like salvation. He hauled himself onto the turret, boots scraping against the warming metal, and saw, with a shock that seemed to slow time, the scene on the road. Tanks ahead and behind were burning, some with small fires licking around their engine decks, others wreathed in full sheets of flame that made their silhouettes waver. Infantrymen ran in all directions, some shooting desperately into the forest, others simply trying to get away from the burning vehicles. And from the tree line, more bottles came, each one a small arc of orange that ended in another splash of fire on Soviet steel. From the Finnish perspective, the battle was a blur of motion and heat against a backdrop of cold white. Laurie's world shrank to a sequence of actions. Light the rag, throw the bottle, duck behind the tree as bullets snapped past, then move to a new position before the tanks could swing their turrets. The roar of engines was now mixed with the hungry crackle of burning fuel and the occasional boom of a tank's ammunition cooking off. Once, as he slid into a new firing position, he saw a Soviet commander scrambling over his turret, trying to pull a crewman up out of the hatch. For a moment, their eyes met across the short distance between forest and road. One man on skis with a bottle in hand, the other on a burning tank, his face smeared with soot and panic. There was no time for anything but recognition. Laurie turned away, hurled his last bottle at the next tank in line, and pushed himself back into the cover of the trees. What had begun as laughter about bottles ended in a grim accounting. Within minutes, several tanks were disabled, their engines dead or their interiors too choked with smoke for the crews to remain inside. Some burned steadily, like torches planted in the snow, their metal hulls groaning as the heat warped them. Others sat with hatches open, smoke pouring out as blackened men crawled away, coughing and clutching at their throats. The column's neat order was shattered. Vehicles stuck behind the front rank had nowhere to go, their drivers trapped between the burning machines ahead and the fear of the unknown forest to the sides. The infantry, lacking clear commands and under fire from rifles and submachine guns that now joined the attack, broke in places, seeking shallow ditches or the thin protection of tree trunks. Eventually, Soviet artillery found its voice, shells screaming overhead to crash into the woods where the Finns had been only moments earlier. Shards of metal and splinters of wood ripped through branches, and explosions sent snow plumes rising in great white fountains. But the ski troops had already begun to melt back into the forest, their movements swift and practiced. They dragged no heavy guns, left no vehicles to mark their retreat, only faint tracks in the snow that the next snowfall would erase. For every man hit by the frantic counter-barrage, several more slipped further into the trees, hearts pounding, breath burning in their chests, ears ringing from the noise. When Laurie finally stopped behind a low ridge, lungs heaving, he turned back to look at the column through the gaps between trees and saw the smoke rising, dark against the pale sky. For Alexei and the surviving Soviet tankers, the aftermath was a bitter mixture of relief at being alive and humiliation at how easily they had been hurt. The cold returned quickly once the immediate heat of the fires faded, and men who had just crawled out of burning vehicles now shivered in wet, soot-streaked uniforms. They coughed smoke from their lungs and tried not to look too long at the wrecks, at the burned paint and the twisted metal that had once been their protection. Around them, officers shouted orders to regroup, to put out remaining fires, to clear the road, but there was a new note in their voices. A tightness, a forced composure that could not completely disguise the shock. Talking quietly among themselves, the tankers mentioned the bottles no longer as a joke, but as a curse. "They threw fire," one of them said, as if the idea still seemed absurd. "They threw fire at us." Back in Finnish positions, the success of the ambush was noted with the practical satisfaction of men who knew they would have to do it again and again. Commanders traced the battle on their maps with gloved fingers, noting where the tanks had stopped, where the hits had been most effective and where the ski teams had taken losses. Reports came in about which mixtures had burned the longest, which bottles had broken cleanly, and which had not. It was a cold, analytical process layered over the hot memory of the fight. For Laurie and his squad, the victory tasted like smoke and frost. They warmed their hands over a small, carefully concealed fire, the flames licking at a kettle that would heat water for coffee, and said little. When they did speak, it was in short remarks about how to do it better next time. Aim higher for the vents, closer for the hatches, throw in pairs at the same target to overwhelm any attempt to smother the flames. Word of the attack, and others like it, spread across the front, carried by messengers, radio, and the ever-reliable soldier's grapevine. In Soviet camps, the story took on a life of its own, growing in detail and dread with each retelling. Some swore the Finns could appear and vanish at will, others that their bottles could burn even on snow or ice. Training officers began to mention improvised firebombs in their briefings, no longer as rumors, but as real threats to be countered with sand, snow, and discipline. Crews were instructed to keep their hatches closed more often, even when the temptation to let in fresh air was strong, and to be ready to move quickly if flames appeared on the hull. It was a sobering shift. Steel was still powerful, but it was no longer unquestioned. For the Finns, the Molotov cocktail became both weapon and symbol. Its very cheapness was its message. A nation with limited industry had found a way to strike at an industrial giant, using tools that could be gathered from barns and village stores. The name, too, carried a sting. Every time a Finnish soldier lit a fuse, he knew he was sending a liquid insult back to the man whose name was stamped on Soviet diplomacy. The bottles appeared in posters, in cartoons pinned to barrack walls, in stories told by the home front to explain how their sons and husbands were fighting back. Children learned the term before they understood how dangerous the weapon really was. It was a way to make sense of an unequal struggle, to believe that cunning could rank alongside cannons. The Winter War would not end in a clean, triumphant victory for Finland. In the months after those first fiery ambushes, the Red Army learned, adapted, and brought even greater weight to bear. There were battles where bottles and skis were not enough against massed artillery and relentless assaults, and villages burned under shells instead of fuel from Finnish hands. When the armistice finally came, the map of Finland had changed. Its borders pushed back, its losses heavy. Yet the country had not been swallowed, and the cost it had exacted on its giant neighbor was far higher than anyone in Moscow had predicted. Among the many reasons for that, historians would later count the tactical use of terrain, the stubbornness of Finnish troops, and, in its own sharp corner, the invention and systematic use of the Molotov cocktail. Long after the snow of 1940 melted, the image of Finns in white parkas hurling bottles at dark Soviet tanks remained. It would be picked up in other wars and uprisings, in cities far from the pine forests of Karelia, by people who had never seen a T-26 or heard a Soviet song. The basic idea was too elegant, too brutal in its simplicity, not to spread. A bottle, a flammable liquid, a rag, and the understanding that modern machines often had vulnerable points where heat and fire could do what ordinary bullets could not. In many languages, the name of the Soviet foreign minister, Molotov, would remain forever attached to that ungainly glass weapon, a linguistic scar left by a small nation on the face of a much larger one. For the men who had been there, though, the memory was less a symbol and more a set of sensations. For Alexei, if he survived the war and the purges and all the turning wheels of history, it would always be the feeling of his gloves sticking briefly to hot metal as he pulled himself out of his burning tank, and the sight of a small flame against a backdrop of snow. For Laurie, it would be the smell of fuel on his mittens, the weight of the bottles in his pack, and the moment when glass shattered against steel and the impossible became possible. They might never know each other's names, but they had met in that instant between laughter and fire, between the old certainty that armor was invincible and the new understanding that even a bottle, in the right hands, could change the course of a battle. In the end, the Winter War offered many lessons to generals, tacticians, and scholars, but one of the most enduring was etched not in ink, but in scorch marks on tank hulls, abandoned by frozen roads. It was the lesson that arrogance can be as dangerous as any enemy weapon, that underestimating the small in favor of the grand is a mistake paid in blood and burnt steel. Soviet tank crews had laughed at the idea of bottles standing against their armored columns. On a narrow Finnish road, under a low gray sky, they discovered that those bottles had been given a new recipe. What they had mocked as harmless had become, in Finnish hands, a flaming answer to invasion, a rude, deadly cocktail that would echo through the rest of the war and far beyond.